Hello and welcome. It is always college football. Today is Thursday, March 20th, and we hope that you're having a terrific start to March Madness week. It's been awesome. Love college basketball this time of year. We will focus on college basketball outside of this hour or so that we spend together. How does that sound? Those of you that are not quite ready to consume some hoop, that's fine. We are here for you. Maybe if you're a football only type of guy, that's fine. Or gal, that's fine. We're good with that. We, however, as soon as we get done preparing this content for you, we're going to dive deep into some college basketball just as a fan because I do love this sporting event. It's one of my favorites on the calendar, and I do like how our playoff system is morphing more and more into a consumable model similar to that of March Madness. But I digress. Not important. The regular season is still the king. And spring season still matters very much here in college football, which is why today we will break down the ACC. We will hit all 17 teams, tell you things that we're thinking about, things that we're looking at, teams that we're kind of considering, spring storylines for every single team, maybe a player or two, maybe a coach move or two, teams with low expectations, teams with high expectations, kind of give you our spring preview here for the Atlantic Coast Conference. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek now that they have Stanford and Cal and SMU, none of which touch the Atlantic, but I digress. We will also remind all of you that if you missed the SEC, you can go back last Monday. Big Ten was just a couple days ago on Monday the 17th, and then we did Big 12 a week ago today. So if you've missed any of the other Power 4 leagues, you can find those at some other point here on the ESPN College Football YouTube channel or with us here on the podcast. So let's kick things off in alphabetical order with the Boston College Eagles. BC, after what was an impressive 7-6 start, 4-4 in the ACC, Bill O'Brien is back for year number 2. The big question, who's going to be the starting quarterback? Did this matter last year? Not as much. Thomas Castellanos was the starter going into last year. He was then benched midway through the season, which led to him transferring and led to the Eagles going with Grayson James as a guy that is going to be the guy going into spring. And then they went in the portal and added Dylan Lonergan from Alabama. The last staff loved Dylan Lonergan. I think this past staff at Alabama also loved him. They thought he was an extremely talented young quarterback. At that point, though, he was just young and was not quite ready to be the starter. But if break glass in case of emergency happened a couple years back, Lonergan might have been the guy to go in relief for Jalen Milroe. Has to be big this time around when you look at what Boston College is stepping into. I think the ACC across the board is quite good. And BC, I think they're going to be a pretty good spot regardless of which direction they go. Whether it's James or Lonergan, they should be just fine. One thing they're going to have to figure out, though, is the offensive line. They've long been the strength of the team for the most part. Now they got to replace a couple pieces up front. That will be significant. Also, defensively, they're going to need to take a couple steps. But, man, I think Boston College has a chance to be a real spoiler this year in the ACC if they can get the quarterback position right. And I think they will because both options are good ones at the moment for Bill O'Brien. The Cal Golden Bears, 6-7, 2-6 in the conference, but a nice out-of-conference win last year over the Auburn Tigers, has Justin Wilcox going into another big year where they overhauled the staff. They lost 4 games close by 5 points or less, so they lost a lot of close games. And I think if you look at last year, man, it felt like a season where it was just almost very, very close, but not quite capable of getting over the hump. They went out, kind of revamped what they were doing offensively, brought in Brian Harsin, the former head coach at Boise State and Auburn, to become the offensive coordinator and quarterback coach. They also brought in some new assistants, helping out with the offensive line, wide receivers, and running backs. And they brought in Nick Rolovich, formerly of Washington State, to be their senior offensive assistant. Now, defensively, they had a couple coaches leave there as well. So I think the biggest question is, one, How do you fill in some of the voids on the staff, and how does the staff work together? I think they'll be fine in that area. And two, looking at some of the positions of intrigue, Fernando Mendoza was the starting quarterback last year. He has since transferred to Indiana. They went out into the transfer portal, brought in Ohio State transfer Devin Brown. He's expected to compete with a highly touted true freshman quarterback in Jaron Kiwi Sagapulatele. So we'll see whether or not he is able to lock down that starting job, because Devin Brown, at times at Ohio State, people thought he was super talented, very athletic, can run. Can he hold off the freshman that was highly touted? We will find out. Originally, it was going to be Sagapulatele that was going to Oregon, and then after committing to Oregon, decided to go after the Rose Bowl game prep to transfer back to Cal after all. So we'll see where it goes. The good news is they have an excellent running back in Jaden Ott that decided to come back. Last year, he had an ankle injury that kind of didn't allow him to be at his very best down the stretch. So with him back and Javion Thomas returning, they should have one of the better running back duos in the entire country, let alone the ACC. The Clemson Tigers enter into the 2025 season with sky-high expectations. We are contributing to those expectations, I might add. I liked Clemson last year. I thought there was a lot of progress made. I love Clemson going into this upcoming season. It does feel like it's the first time in quite a while where the expectations feel tangible. Does feel like with what was returning off of a successful season last year, something can be built on. The foundation has been laid out multiple years in the making now, was this roster here in 25. Now is the time for them to break through and to return to the top of college football as a potential national championship contender. They decided to make some changes to their staff. Wes Goodwin was the defensive coordinator. He was let go. They went out and they hired one of the best defensive coordinators in the country, Tom Allen, to come down from Penn State. They got to find a pass rush. That is imperative. They also need to find some depth along the defensive line. TJ Parker is a complete game changer at one defensive end. Peter Woods on the other, even though he got banged up a little bit, he's probably not best suited to play defensive end. He's probably going to be a little more disruptive on the interior. So finding a capable replacement for the edge to allow Woods to slide inside is of the utmost importance this upcoming season. One other position that I'll be paying close attention to is the running back spot. Phil Maffa wasn't the same. Down the stretch, they just didn't run the ball very well whatsoever, and they got a lot of injuries to that position. Their top backup last year got banged up in the ACC championship game. They are ridiculously thin at running back, which has forced a former blue chip wide receiver in Adam Randall to make a full switch from wide receiver to running back. So he, along with a few others, Gideon Davidson is the name to know. He's the freshman, and Dabo Swinney believes he could be one of the best freshman running backs that they've had in his tenure there with the Tigers. That's saying a lot, too. You think about ETN, you think about Will Shipley, guys that had a lot of success early in their career. If Dabo Swinney's putting Gideon Davidson in that type of light, he might be poised to have a breakthrough season in year number one. One other thing that I'm really curious about is, for the very first time, Clemson has started to dabble in the transfer portal just a little bit. They've tried in the past unsuccessfully. This year they tried and succeeded by bringing in Will Height from Purdue. That was one of the biggest signings, I think, because we talked already about what it would mean for Peter Woods if a new piece emerged at defensive end. Well, Height might very well be that guy. He will be a fascinating person to watch throughout the offseason because it's one of the first transfer portal additions that Dabo Swinney's ever gone out and landed, and he's playing a position of need. Defensive end, they did not have enough depth, and the drop-off from the starters to the backups was considerable last year. Hopefully that won't be the case with some of the reinforcements that have come in and some of the young players that have developed for a sky-high season with expectations for the Clemson Tigers. The Duke Blue Devils have quietly become one of the better and more consistent teams in the ACC. Fresh off a 9-4 season, a year in which they went 5-3 in the league, there's only a couple teams with more conference wins the last 3 years than Duke. Duke has 14 conference wins the last 3 years. Clemson and Louisville are the only two with more. Says an awful lot about what's been created over multiple coaching staffs, by the way. If you look at what was left and now what Manny Diaz has to work with, they should be in a position to compete at or near the mid to upper tier of the ACC yet again. 9-4 last year, they went out and I think they improved at quarterback. They went out and got Darian Mensah at quarterback. He transfers over from Tulane. We'll be watching him closely. A lot of people wanted him. Yes, it was a splashy transfer portal addition, but there's a lot of question marks about what his weaponry will be at wide receiver. The top two receivers and their top tight end from last year have all departed. In their wake, Quayshawn Brown, who emerged late in the season, a couple of transfers like Andrell Anthony from Oklahoma and Cooper Barkate from Princeton. Those two guys are going to be expected to be relied upon early and often for new quarterback Darian Mensah. So I think they have three guys. It's just not all are super proven there in Durham. One other thing to keep an eye on is Jarquez Moore, who is supposed to be the centerpiece of the offense, but got banged up. That kind of lagged what his capabilities were last year. He had just 32 carries. He might be positioned to kind of be an all-around versatile piece for him on what should be a pretty balanced attack. So remember that name, Jarquez Moore, a running back that they are excited about there at Duke as a possible go-to guy in both the passing game and in the rushing attack. The Florida State Seminoles are trying to bounce back from what was an abysmal and disappointing 2-10 campaign last year. They were 1-7 overall in the league, and I'm just going to preface this by saying I feel like I'm taking crazy pills a little bit. I'm going to be honest with you. I might be the only person in the media that is somewhat bullish on what Florida State can be this year. Now, part of that has to do with how far they fell and what the standard assessment is for the Seminoles. That's fair. If you don't believe in Florida State because they were 2-10 last year, by all means, that is well within your right. I happen to look at the staff. I happen to look at Mike Norvell. I happen to look at the additions at defensive coordinator and more specifically offensive coordinator. And I'm actually feeling quite good about the likely bounce back from the Seminoles this year. It's hard. It's hard to bounce back from a 13-0 ACC championship game, sky-high expectations, and a lot of transfer portal guys that really were probably overbilled going into last year. Let's be real. I'd be surprised, though, if it's another down year. Mike Norvell said that this team has put a priority on going and getting guys that are going to display a tremendous character, have tremendous work ethic, that their attitude and the chip on their shoulder, that was a priority when assessing them in the portal. But if you look at kind of what was gone and what was brought in, might not necessarily be as star-studded from a talent standpoint, but I still think they're going to be in a pretty good spot. The most interesting position is the quarterback spot. Thomas Castellanos transfers down from Boston College. And if you look at Thomas Castellanos' career, there have been some outrageously impressive moments. One of the most impressive moments of his career actually came against Florida State. This was a couple years ago, and I remember watching that game. He was the quarterback of BC at the time. And on third down alone, just on third down, he had 92 yards rushing. Goes to show you, he's a game breaker, but there have been points in his career where he's been a little bit inconsistent. Now, can he be a little bit better throwing the football? Sure, I would hope so. But I look at the offense that he's going to be running, and that's an offense led by Gus Malzahn, the new offensive coordinator for the Seminoles. And that's an offense that's going to put a lot of strain on the defense by utilizing the run game, utilizing tempo, and utilizing quarterback run. So I love where they're going to be offensively. I love the marriage between the quarterback and the offensive coordinator that's going to be made with Malzahn and Castellanos. The big question is, can they get the offensive line right? Because the offensive line was a disaster last year. If they can't block, it doesn't matter what style of attack they're going to use. They are not going to be able to move the ball effectively if the offensive line doesn't take a significant step forward this year. But I think they will. I'd be shocked if they were as bad and as inconsistent as they were a year ago. The defense is also something that we're paying a lot of attention to. Now, new coordinator, Tony White, who, by the way, I love that hire. I think it's a great hire. Brings in a couple transfers with him from Nebraska. You bring in James Williams and you bring in Stephon Thompson. Two guys, if he's bringing them with him, tells me all I need to know. Now, Williams, he's got a lot of hype. And they're going to have to get back to doing it the way things were done a couple of years ago, where Jermaine Johnson, Jared Verse, in a 4-year span, those guys terrorized opposing quarterbacks. Last year, it took a huge step back. But I think some of the departures off last year's team might be additions by subtraction, if you will. I think they're going to be okay on that side of the ball, but they got to make sure that they're a little more consistent at all three levels defensively. But I'm telling you, man, I think a lot of people have kind of left Florida State out to just dwindle off in mediocrity. I would not count them out this year. Do I anticipate a playoff run? No, maybe not that far of a turnaround, but I would be shocked if they aren't at or near the top of the ACC discussion when we fast forward to the end of the year. The Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets are trying to build on what was a really solid season for Brent Key last year. They went 7-6, but had they stayed healthy at the quarterback spot, who knows what might have been for the ACC spoiler of the season last year. Haynes King, their quarterback, is back, and there's a lot to like about what's been established with their offense in Georgia Tech. Now, Haynes King's a burner, very athletic, very gifted with the ball in his hands, probably needs to be a little smarter, not take as many hits. The guy's a warrior. He plays really hard, but he does occasionally subject himself to a little too much contact, and I love how competitive he is, but he probably doesn't need to do so at the risk of maybe missing time down the road. He will have a little bit different cast of characters around him. Eric Singleton, his top wide receiver, is now transferred to Auburn, but he does bring back Malik Rutherford and a couple other transfers, and Eric Rivers and Dean Patterson, who transferred from FIU, to create some of that same speed that they utilized in success last year. Those two guys, Rivers and Patterson, they combined for 112 catches and 19 touchdowns last year. They also, I think, have plenty of things to feel good about with their offensive and defensive lines this upcoming season. They brought in one of the best offensive line recruits in the history of Georgia Tech. That's Josh Petty. He's a 5-star player. He's their first 5-star signee since Calvin Johnson. If he can step right in, that could be huge. Probably going to be in the starting 5. And if you can get along with some of the veterans that they have up front, they should be in a really good spot to be one of the better position groups on the entire roster. Georgia Tech, I think 7-6 last year was a rock-solid season. I'd expect even a little bit more this year if they can adequately replace some of the pieces that were lost. The Louisville Cardinals are almost always flying under the radar, and yet I'll never understand why. They were 9-4 last year. They were 5-3. They've been one of the most consistent winners in the ACC the last handful of years. And Jeff Brom, I think, did the best he possibly could a couple years ago with Jack Plummer. Then last year, watch how he developed Tyler Shuck into one of the more productive, one of the more physically gifted quarterbacks in the country. So each of the last 2 years, he took guys that were projects and liabilities at times and had injury history and had questionable traits coming in, and he made them into big-time difference makers at the college level. Well, third time's a charm. Now he's going to go with Miller Moss, transfer over from USC, and you can make a case that he is probably one of the more accurate quarterbacks that he's inherited. I don't know if he has quite as much arm talent as Tyler Shuck, but I do think from a decision-making standpoint, from an accuracy standpoint, they should be in a really good spot. They also have some talented playmakers around them. They got an emerging star at running back in Isaac Brown, and the return of Colin Lacey at wide receiver will be significant. I think if you look at this group from an explosiveness standpoint, I'd be surprised if Louisville's offense isn't one of the most explosive and entertaining offenses to watch in the entire country. The big question is the secondary. That was a group that was at times a strength over the last couple of years, but now there are some question marks surrounding it, given some of the pieces that have departed. They went out and added a bunch of guys in the portal. They're going to be trying to compete for those spots because they lost a great outside cover guy in Quincy Riley. So how this unit gels, especially in the ACC, is going to be really intriguing to see what happens there with this group from top to bottom. The other thing that I'm really curious about, Isaac Brown last year was amazing. Well, one of the best freshmen in the country, went for over 1,527 all-purpose yards. But if you look at the explosiveness, a guy that you need to know is Duke Watson. Watson didn't get a ton of carries, didn't get a ton of touches, had just 67 carries, but he averaged more than 8.5 yards per carry, nearly 9 yards per carry. He also had 7 touchdowns. So now him and Brown, you have a very intriguing 1-2 punch at running back, 2 guys that could take it the distance if the opportunity presents itself. So keep sleeping on Louisville. I dare you. At some point, people are going to recognize that Jeff Brom has built a consistent winner and one that will always flirt with 9 or 10 wins on an annual basis. The Miami Hurricanes are up next, and while it didn't finish the way they wanted it to, I think most people can look at 2024 and feel pretty good about the direction that Mario Cristobal has this program heading. Part of the problem last year with the inconsistencies on defense. Now, look, this was a group that had some talent, but they also had some guys that were banged up, and they were really not good from a tackling standpoint whatsoever. As a result, Lance Guidry, their defensive coordinator, he was gone. All right, new defensive coordinator, Corey Heatherman, he's taken over, and I think they're going to have a potentially dominant unit in the front. Now, starts with having a healthy Ruben Bain. If he's not healthy, you got some problems. He was banged up all throughout last year, but here's hoping year number 3 for Ruben Bain. He has a clean bill of health and can continue to terrorize opposing offenses like he did as a true freshman 2 years ago. The big question is, how is the quarterback position going to play? We know what Cam Ward was. Right? We know how good he was, how electric he was, how accurate, how he held everyone around him accountable, the leadership that he had on display. He was amazing. Slam dunk superstar, and will have a very lucrative career in the NFL. Well, a guy that's starting to kind of press the reset button and hopefully get back to being one of the top draft picks in this upcoming draft in 2026 is Carson Beck. A lot of people going into last year thought he was the number 1 quarterback in the country. If you were to ask me last year going into the year, who's the one quarterback that you trust the most, it probably would have been Carson Beck. He had such a great 2023 campaign. To see him struggle at times in 24 was, for the most part, pretty dang shocking. But it's not about talent. He's always had the talent. Last year, it was as much about the supporting cast as it was about Carson Beck. His wide receivers led the country in drops. His offensive line was extremely inconsistent, and they couldn't run the football at all. Georgia averaged like 100 yards rushing a game, one of the worst rushing attacks in the country. So all the pressure was on Carson Beck's shoulders, and as a result, he pressed. That pressing led to mistakes. Those mistakes led to interceptions. Those interceptions led to people questioning whether or not he was really that good to begin with. I can answer all those questions. Carson Beck is really talented. Will he need to bounce back? Yes. Will he need to showcase mental toughness? Yes. Will he need to showcase leadership? Yes. All those things are true, but it's not about talent with him. It's about the supporting cast. And if the guys around him play well, much better than the guys around him played last year, he can lead this team to an ACC title, and he can lead this team to the college football playoff. he might even be able, depending on how good his defense can become, might even be able to lead this team into becoming a national championship contender. But Carson Beck, I expect a big bounce back season from him in general. I also think, though, that the receivers, the run game, the offensive line, and specifically the defense, all those guys are going to need to be better for Miami if they're going to challenge for another college football playoff spot this year. They also, like I said already, the defensive backs, they need to figure that out. They need to figure out additional players along the front defensively to take some of the heat off Reuben Bain. There's a lot to like about Miami, but there are also a lot of question marks as well. I think they are a legit ACC title contender. I think they're a college football playoff contender, but I cannot put them in the national championship contender status just yet. There's just too many unknowns on the defensive side. Next up, the NC State Wolfpack, who had a really disappointing 2024 campaign. Last year in the preseason, there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of excitement. There were a lot of people that thought NC State was going to be that team in the ACC that really challenged for a playoff spot and possibly even an ACC title, and it just never materialized. As a result, they've kind of reassessed where they're at, and they're going to go about it in a slightly different way. You got to appreciate Dave Doran. He'll try it, but if it doesn't work, man, he's done with it. And last year, you look at it, they hit the portal really hard. They went out and they signed a bunch of guys. They brought in a quarterback that people thought had a chance to take the team to the next level. Well, he gets banged up. The other guys that they brought in the portal really weren't as good as what we originally thought they were going to be. And offensively, they were just way too inconsistent. And Dave Doran had to learn some hard lessons as a result of last year's performance. The inconsistency and the lack of toughness were eye-opening when you have kind of come to expect NC State to be one of the more physically imposing teams, chip on the shoulder outfit. That wasn't who they were last year. And it looks like Dave Doran has reassessed, and now they are putting an increased level of emphasis on chemistry, on culture, on creating continuity. I think that's going to be for the benefit of the Wolfpack moving forward. They did find somebody that they can build around last year in quarterback CJ Bailey. There were moments when you watched him and you felt great about what he showed, but there were also moments where, as a freshman, he showed that he still has a long way to go. The one thing they have to do is they have to help him out along the offensive line. Last year, that group, for the most part, struggled. They weren't anywhere near as good as they need to be if this team is going to be as good as it could potentially become. They got to be tougher. They got to be more physical. And the offensive line is a great place to start. They went out and added a bunch of guys in the transfer portal along the front, and hopefully that will allow that group to create cohesiveness this spring. If that group can create cohesiveness, they might be in a pretty good spot to improve the run game. You look at Hollywood Smothers and Kendrick Raphael, those guys got a chance to be really good, but it's the group up front that's going to have to be able to open holes for those running backs at some point down the road. They have not finished in the top 8 in the ACC in rushing yards per game since 2017. It's been a while since NC State has been excellent running the football. But the big key is the quarterback spot. If Bailey can have a great year, then they might be in a position to do a lot of really nice things. If he has a challenging year where he doesn't make great progress, then they're probably going to be a middling team in the ACC. But 22-10 touchdown interception ratio last year looks pretty good on paper, right? And you also take into account he was kind of thrust in the starting lineup. It wasn't like he had an entire offseason to really work on his timing and his accuracy and his chemistry. Now he has no excuses. He's got the entire offseason where he knows he's the guy. They have a new quarterback coach in Kurt Roper to become the offensive coordinator. And I think that will help Bailey become the best player he can become. And I think Kurt Roper will help bring him along, having been around the game for a very long time as well. The North Carolina Tar Heels may be one of the biggest stories of the entire offseason. When you go out and you finish the season 6-7, 3-5 in the ACC, not a lot of people are going to pay attention to what you do this offseason. Let's just be real. a lot of the focus is going to be maybe on the Clemsons of the world, the Miamis of the world, the teams that have legitimate chance to make a run at the college football playoff. But North Carolina said, enough of that. We want to be the center of attention. We're going to go out and we're going to hire a 6-time Super Bowl winning head coach to take over the program. That's right. Bill Belichick, he's in Chapel Hill. And this is by far one of the biggest coaching hires in, college football in recent memory, isn't it? And never in a million years did I think Bill Belichick was actually going to consider coaching a college program. But here we are. It's 2025, and it is crazy to think about. But either way, it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. The big key is the quarterback spot. Tom Brady is probably the greatest quarterback in the history of the game. If you think someone else is, that's fine. But Tom Brady and Bill Belichick, they worked in tandem en route to 6 Super Bowl championships, okay? Well, there is not an obvious Brady to go with here on North Carolina's roster, all right? We know that this is a group that does have some talent and some experience. Max Johnson, probably the best example of that. He's been playing football for quite a while. He did suffer a bad leg injury in the opener, so probably not going to be at 100% at any point until fall camp. So that's when we'll get a good assessment of what he's going to be. So in the spring, it's probably going to be Ryan Brown, the transfer from Purdue, Bryce Baker, who's the true freshman, and Bryce Baker is the guy that many are saying he's going to be the piece that can help elevate this program to the next level. So figuring out the quarterback spot is the first order of business. The other thing is fixing the defense. If you think about North Carolina for quite a while, the defense has been a huge challenge. I mean, it really has. And they have tried under multiple head coaches, multiple different defensive coordinators. They have tried to bring out the best of this defense for as long as I can remember. I can think back to when Larry Fedora was there and the challenges that they had on defense. I can think back to what happened with Gene Chizik and then Jeff Collins. And they've tried a million different ways to make this group cohesive defensively, and it just hasn't materialized for whatever reason. Now, Belichick's son, Steve, is going to be the defensive coordinator. And that, I think, will be beneficial because if you look at what Steve did at Washington last year, he did a pretty good job. And Washington won some games or were competitive in some games that many people didn't think they'd be competitive in because of how they performed on the defensive side. He also brought with him a couple of guys, and Thaddeus Dixon at corner and Peyton Waters at safety to help kind of ease the transition into what should be a new defensive scheme. So North Carolina, one of the more fascinating teams of the offseason, and one that will have lots of attention being paid to them with how they perform in the spring. The Pitt Panthers got off to a great start last year. They were 7-0. Everything was looking amazing. And then, boom, everything came crashing back to earth. They lost 6 straight games down the stretch to finish the season 7-6. And look, they won a lot of games in 2021. They won a lot of games in 2022. I don't think many people expected them to win a lot of games last year, but for a while, man, they were real competitive there in the ACC. They did find a couple things that you got to feel really optimistic about. Eli Holstein, transfer from Alabama to become the starting quarterback. He was great when he was available. He did get banged up. A couple of injuries that kind of disrupted where he was in the middle of the season. But if he can avoid those, avoid big hits, avoid contact that can easily be avoided, he has a chance, I think, to be one of the better quarterbacks in the ACC. They also have Desmond Reed. He's back as well. Love Desmond Reed. If you haven't had a chance to watch him, he's one of the best all-purpose running backs in the entire country. Not only is he super dynamic as a ball carrier, but he's one of the best pass-catching running backs in the entire sport. Highly recommend watching him. He's a transfer from Western Carolina. He's just a lot of fun to watch. Just a very exciting player. And I think year number 2 under Cade Bell, their offensive coordinator, is going to prove for both those guys to be even more advanced in the system than they were a year ago. The offensive line was a challenge last year. The right side of the offensive line was a challenge last year. If they can figure out the offensive line, protect their quarterback, they have a chance to be pretty good offensively. They do have a few things to figure out on defense. They have always done a really good job of creating pressure, sacks, tackles for loss. That is a staple of Pat Narduzzi type defenses, but they are without some big difference makers there in the back end. They lost all ACC safety Donovan McMillan. He's off to the NFL, but they are encouraged by some of the young guys that might be stepping up to replace some key pieces in the second and third level on the defense. So I like Pitt this year. I think they could be a spoiler and a team that can cause some problem for some of the favorites in the league. The SMU Mustangs, an impressive first year in the ACC. They went 11-3. They were undefeated in conference play before losing to the Clemson Tigers in the ACC championship game. Last year was really impressive to see how seamless the transition was for Rhett Lashley and company from the AAC into the ACC. I did not anticipate, fully admit, I did not anticipate them being as competitive as they were in the month of November. I thought they'd be really good in September, October, only to see things come back to earth a little bit in the final few games of the season. I just thought the depth would take its toll and the increased physicality would take its toll. But SMU, understanding how much more difficult it was going to be, they did a great job of getting out in front of it, adding reinforcements before the season even started, and creating a very deep roster with veterans that they brought in via the portal so that the level of play would not drop off at any point in the season. As a result, because of their effort, they made it to the playoff. And as a result, they nearly won the ACC championship before losing to Clemson in the ACC title game on a last-second walk-off field goal. So I think you should feel great about where they're at, but there are things to figure out, in particular, the running back spot. Rashard Smith went from wide receiver at Miami 2 years ago to starting running back at SMU, and he was super dynamic. School record, 1,977 all-purpose yards. Having anybody that can even come close to replacing Rashard Smith would be an amazing feat. They did sign Miami transfer Chris Johnson, hoping that they can kind of do something the same way that Rashard Smith did, who, by the way, also was a Miami transfer. Johnson, as a few other guys there in the running back rotation, like Derek McFall and LJ Johnson, who also looked pretty good at times, taking some of the pressure off Rashard Smith, but figuring out who's going to replace Smith will be the number one priority for Rhett Lashley and his offense. Number two will be getting Kevin Jennings to take the next step as a development quarterback. Did a great job. Really, a great job at times last year. But 3 interceptions against Penn State in the playoffs, 2 of which were returned to the house, is not exactly how you wanted to finish the season. He also made a bunch of questionable decisions against Clemson there in the ACC championship game as well. It's really more mechanics than anything else. When you watch Kevin Jennings, he's got great playmaking ability, unbelievable playmaking ability. When he's on the move, he's accurate, he's decisive, he plays bigger than you realize. But there are times when he's in the pocket where he's way too deep in the pocket and he's putting too much pressure on the tackles. There are times when he tries to escape to his right, like most right-handed quarterbacks. And that's exactly what the defense wants him to do, because they have a guy that's overhanging to the right side and then just closes and forces him to make a quick decision that's either intercepted or it's thrown away, or in some cases he's hit with a big collision there in the backfield. Kevin Jennings is close to becoming a massive difference maker. If he can just clean up a few things from a mechanic standpoint, he could be poised to take the next step. I like SMU a lot this year. I don't think they'll be quite as good as they were a year ago, but they still have a chance to be a problem against just about everyone they play. The Stanford Cardinal had a disappointing 3-9 campaign in their first year in the ACC. And if you look at where things were, it's about the way things were when they were in the Pac-12. They've been 3-9 for 4 consecutive years. Now, Troy Taylor, the head coach, this is his 3rd year as the head coach at Stanford. And now it's time to kind of showcase a little growth, showcase a little improvement. They went out in the portal and they tried very hard to fill some of the holes that they had to fill, like a defensive back. They had to fill it on the offensive line. They had to fill it wide receiver. They do have some young talent that they feel pretty good about, and I think Taylor likes some of his young players, but they're going to have to figure out some of the veterans that are going to be leaders for this roster. They did lose some key pieces at quarterback. Ashton Daniels and Justin Lamson are gone. Their former four-star recruit, Elijah Brown, expected to enter into the spring as the starting quarterback. He came to Stanford as a top 300 prospect. I think when he signed, people immediately said, all right, we're going to be in a good spot. But an injury last year never really allowed him to get on the field, and we never got real glimpse as to what he can be. So this will be intriguing because all new wide receivers. They have to replace Alec Ayomanor. That's a big one as well. He was a big-time game changer there on the outside. So they went to the portal. They got a guy from South Carolina State, Colorado, and from Wisconsin. So it'll be fascinating to see how the Stanford offense gels because there's a ton of question marks on that side of the ball. The Syracuse Orange had a great 2024 season en route to a 10-win year for Fran Brown. I'm not sure many people would have expected 10 wins in year number one. The first 10-win season for Syracuse since 2018, and their first, really big opportunity to kind of showcase the world what Syracuse might look like in this new era of college football. The cherry on top was the win over Miami that kept the Hurricanes out of the ACC championship game. And as a result, Fran Brown celebrated on the field and told Dabo, you're welcome, essentially, for allowing them to get in. They have to replace a lot. All right, they replaced Kyle McCord at quarterback, who was one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the country last year. They have to replace LaQuint Allen at running back, and they have to replace Aronde Gadsden. All those guys being gone leaves a ton of question marks about who's going to step up in pivotal spots at quarterback, running back, and wide receiver, and those will not be easy positions to fill. McCord is by far the most difficult. Ricky Collins transfers up from LSU. They also bring back their quarterback, Michael Johnson, and they have the redshirt freshman, Jakari Williams. That'll be a three-way quarterback derby, probably leaning slightly towards Jakari Williams right now. But either way, there's still a ton of questions about whether or not the offense is going to be as efficient through the air with any of the aforementioned three that are going to be replacing McCord. I think it's tough to anticipate them being anywhere near as good through the year as they were a year ago. You look at also what they're going to have to find is that they do have depth at the quarterback spot, but they did not go out and attack the portal the same way they did a year ago. Thought there'd be some that would be able to be added like they did a year ago, maybe some star-studded pass rushers or some guys that might have a huge difference, but we're not really sure at this point why portal was not as much of a priority as it was last season. They did go out and land a defensive lineman named Chris Thomas from Marshall. That should help with the run defense, but we're not really sure about how that one addition along the defensive front is going to be able to boost this group collectively. So a lot of questions around Syracuse, a lot of new faces around Syracuse, but reason for optimism based on how year one went for Fran Brown. The Virginia Cavaliers come off yet another disappointing 5-7 season. They went out and they got 16 players in the portal in hopes of allowing this to be the season for Tony Elliott where they really break through. Now, a lot of people can kind of feel good about the progress that's been made, but it hasn't necessarily been felt as far as wins and losses. I think if you look at where they're at, they lost Anthony Calandria to the portal. They lost Tony Muskett his final year of eligibility. They went to the portal to find their next quarterback. That's Chandler Morris, who is now at his fourth different school, was at North Texas and has bounced around all over the place in that kind of region of the country. Now he's up in Virginia, and he was pretty outspoken about why he chose Virginia. They expect to win. He believes they can win, but he's going to have to play great for this group to take the next step. If you look at some of the other pieces of significance this year for Virginia, they did add a linebacker transfer from UNLV and Fisher K-Mac. He's got a guy that people have kind of raved about. He had 15 tackles for a loss and 7.5 sacks last year by himself. So keep an eye on him. This group collectively might be quite a bit better, Virginia, because of those portal additions. But continuity will be of the utmost importance this year because there's a lot of new faces that are going to be playing next to guys that are unfamiliar because they weren't on the roster last year. The Virginia Tech Hokies had a disappointing 6-7 season last year. Many thought they were the dark horse sleeper in the ACC, and it just never materialized. As a result, they lost 24 players to the transfer portal. They saw some of their best players go to the NFL draft, but they do bring back Kyron Drones, who has done a lot and has seen a lot, but is extremely talented, and they're going to have to continue to build things around him. Let's look at the offense quickly, and you look at the running back room in particular, and Bayshell Tootin is off to the NFL. Backup Malachi Thomas decided to transfer, so they went out and they signed 3 transfer running backs, one from Bowling Green, one from Coastal Carolina, and one from Central Missouri State. How will they marry up with Drones at quarterback and try to create problems with the run game that they will present to the opposition? They also brought in a Wake Forest transfer named Donovan Green, who's experienced and is a veteran presence because this wide receiver group for Virginia Tech, albeit talented, they are a little bit inexperienced and they are really unproven at the moment. Green's had some injury problems, but here's hoping that those are behind him and he can now move forward with a clean bill of health at a new start. But it's really going to be about the offense, getting those young players up to speed on the perimeter and making sure those transfers at running back can play alongside Drones, who will be their playmaker, and hopefully he can be a little more consistent this upcoming year for the Hokies as well. Last but certainly not least, it's the Wake Forest Demon Deacons. Big story for them this offseason is the new arrival of head coach Jake Dickert, who replaced Dave Clawson, was there for 11 years, one of the best coaches in the history of Wake Forest. But Dickert did an awful lot in his time at Washington State. I mean, it was tough, very tough situation with the changes in the Pac-12 dissolving and him being thrust in the middle of the 2020 campaign, just a challenging situation, but he's done a pretty good job. There will be a new offensive scheme for the first time in 12 years. Think about what they did under Dave Clawson, some of the slow mesh concepts that became synonymous with Wake Forest football. Those are the thing of the past. You can anticipate it being a little bit more high flying, a little bit more predicated on throwing the ball around the yard. And you might expect it to look a little bit more like when Sam Hartman was in charge back in 2021. I think that's a fair assessment of what this offense might look like and how it could go. But it's going to depend a little bit on what the quarterback situation looks like. They bring in sophomore Jeremy Hecklinski. He's back, but you also bring in Robbie Ashford from South Carolina and Deshaun Purdy, who played at Charlotte last year as a freshman. He did sign originally with Florida, but decided to leave soon after that. One other position of significance is at running back, where Damon Claiborne is one of the most under-the-radar players that you probably have never heard of. He's the real deal. And I think he can be not just dynamic as a running back, but also as a kickoff return man with how he handles the ball in the open space. And I think probably going to, because they might be a little bit short on playmakers, I think he'll factor in quite a bit offensively at other positions as well for the Demon Deacons. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to encourage all of you, for those of you that have never been with us before, if you could like, if you could rate, if you could subscribe to the show, that'd be amazing. We really appreciate the support you've shown the show here over the last few years. So for all of us here at ACF, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football.